Sophie had always thought her life was steady, predictable, and safe, the kind of life most people envied quietly without realizing how much it cost her in quiet longing. She loved Daniel deeply. He was kind, patient, and dependable, the man who had built a home and a family with her, the man whose smile could calm storms and whose laughter had once made her chest ache with happiness. But lately, Sophie felt a gnawing emptiness she couldn't quite name, a subtle itch that made her mornings feel heavier, her evenings lonelier, and her heart restless in ways she hadn't experienced in years. Work had become her escape, a place where she could immerse herself in tasks and deadlines and feel a sense of purpose that her home routine no longer offered, and it was there, among the hum of computers and the constant shuffle of papers, that she first noticed Ethan, her new coworker, a man who had a quiet charm that seemed to sneak under her defenses, who smiled with eyes that lingered just a second too long and listened with a focus that made her feel seen in ways she hadn't realized she craved. At first, Sophie told herself it was all professional, that friendship at work was harmless and normal, that shared jokes over morning coffee or fleeting conversations by the printer were nothing more than coincidences of timing and shared office stress. Yet she felt a spark she couldn't explain, a warmth in her chest when Ethan laughed at something she said, the way his voice softened when he asked how her day was, the way he remembered small details about her life, the way he leaned slightly closer than necessary when he spoke, and suddenly Sophie realized that excitement, that thrill she hadn't felt in years, was making her heart beat faster, making her palms tingle, making ordinary tasks feel alive, and she felt both terrified and exhilarated all at once. The mornings she spent getting ready became moments of nervous anticipation. Even the drive to work, usually monotonous and quiet, now seemed charged with possibility, her mind replaying snippets of conversations, remembering the way Ethan's hair caught the light, or the little smile that had appeared when she mentioned a weekend plan, and she felt a mixture of guilt and longing that twisted her stomach every time she imagined what could never happen, every time she remembered Daniel's warm hug, his soft reassurance, his trust in her, and yet, the pull toward Ethan was magnetic, irresistible, and for the first time in a long while, Sophie felt both alive and conflicted, aware of the danger yet unable to resist the fluttering emotions that came with small, seemingly innocent interactions that slowly began to take over her thoughts. She started noticing details she hadn't before, the way Ethan's eyes crinkled when he laughed, the way he remembered to ask about her weekend even when he had been busy with his own projects, the way he offered small gestures that seemed insignificant to anyone else but felt monumental to her, gestures that made her feel appreciated, admired, seen in ways that had been absent from her daily life. Sophie tried to push these feelings away, to focus on her marriage, to remind herself that Daniel was her world, that their life together was full of love, stability, and shared dreams, but the longer she spent with Ethan, the more the boundaries blurred, and she found herself craving the attention he gave her, replaying conversations, lingering on fleeting touches, imagining what it might be like to feel that kind of closeness again, imagining moments she would never admit to anyone, not even herself at first, and the guilt began to mix with longing in a strange cocktail of emotion that left her restless at night, staring at the ceiling while Daniel slept beside her, thinking about what she had always wanted and what she now feared she was losing, and she wondered if this excitement, this rush of forbidden attention, was a sign of her own dissatisfaction, a reflection of unmet needs, or simply a dangerous temptation that she should resist before it destroyed everything she held dear. Sophie's internal struggle grew with each passing day, making her jittery, distracted, and emotionally volatile in ways Daniel noticed, though he didn't understand the root cause. He asked if something was wrong, if she was stressed at work, if she needed a break, and Sophie nodded, forcing a smile, muttering reassurances that everything was fine, all the while knowing that the secret she kept inside was a seed that could grow into something far more dangerous than a simple crush. The tension built like a storm on the horizon, every glance from Ethan, every shared laugh, every inside joke created a mix of fear and desire, a yearning for a connection that shouldn't exist, a pull toward something that felt alive and intoxicating yet so clearly wrong. She began to notice herself lingering after meetings, looking for excuses to walk past his desk, feeling her heart speed up when their hands brushed accidentally or when he offered her coffee without asking, feeling her thoughts drift during hours meant for work as she imagined conversations that might never happen outside these walls. Sophie tried to reason with herself, telling herself she was only seeking a spark, a distraction, a fleeting feeling of being noticed, yet she couldn't deny the emotional intensity that grew with each passing day. She imagined Daniel's disappointment if he knew, felt the weight of the vows she had made, the promises to be faithful, the trust that had been placed in her hands, and yet her mind betrayed her, picturing stolen moments, secret smiles, and whispered words that existed only in the imagination but felt achingly real. One evening, after a long day of meetings and tight deadlines, Sophie found herself lingering in the office when the building was nearly empty, Ethan asking if she wanted to grab a cup of coffee, a casual question that sent her pulse racing, a small adventure in the middle of ordinary life, and she accepted, feeling a thrill she immediately regretted, and as they walked down the quiet streets to the cafe, talking about projects and life and dreams, Sophie felt both exhilarated and terrified. Realizing she was stepping into dangerous territory but unable to stop herself, unable to resist the emotional pull that Ethan exerted, a magnetism that seemed to reach into the parts of her heart she had forgotten existed. As she sipped the coffee, listening to Ethan recount a funny story about a coworker, laughing in a way that felt dangerously intimate, Sophie caught herself thinking of Daniel, the life they had built together, the warmth of his presence, and felt a jolt of guilt so sharp it made her stomach twist, yet the warmth of Ethan's smile, the gentleness in his voice, and the way he seemed to see her in a way no one else had in years made her wonder if life had always been missing something she hadn't known she needed, and that dangerous question lingered in her mind, threatening the stability of everything she had once held sacred. The night ended with Sophie returning home, heart racing, stomach knotted with shame and longing, Daniel asking how her day had been, and she forced herself to smile, to tell a mundane story about her workday, feeling the weight of a secret she couldn't yet name fully pressing down on her chest, knowing that one wrong step, one moment of weakness, could unravel the carefully constructed life she had built, and as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, Sophie felt the storm of emotions swirling inside her, guilt, excitement, longing, fear, and desire, all interwoven, all dangerous, all thrilling, and all pointing to a single undeniable truth. Something had changed inside her, something that would force her to confront choices she never imagined making, desires she never thought she would feel, and consequences she could barely begin to foresee. And as the city lights dimmed outside her window, Sophie realized that her heart had already started to wander, already started to seek something new, something forbidden, something that could either awaken her or destroy her, and with that thought, sleep finally took her, heavy with dreams of laughter, closeness, and an emotional storm she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Sophie's days grew more complicated as her connection with Ethan deepened, the boundaries between friendship and something more blurring faster than she had ever imagined possible, each encounter at work sending waves of excitement and guilt crashing over her in equal measure, making it harder to focus on tasks she had once handled with ease, and leaving her evenings heavy with thoughts she couldn't escape, thoughts that circled endlessly in her mind while Daniel asked mundane questions about her day, unaware of the emotional storm raging behind her calm exterior. She found herself searching for excuses to be near Ethan, lingering longer after meetings, offering to help with projects he was working on, finding any reason to see him, to hear him laugh, to feel that subtle spark that made her pulse race, a sensation so intense it both thrilled and terrified her. At first, she justified it to herself as innocent curiosity, a need to feel alive, a way to connect with someone who seemed to understand the parts of her that had grown quiet in the routine of marriage. Yet she couldn't ignore the way her stomach fluttered whenever Ethan complimented her work, praised her ideas, or simply caught her eye across the office, and every smile he gave her felt like both a gift and a trap, drawing her deeper into a web of emotions she knew were dangerous. Coffee breaks became longer, conversations spilled into hallways, emails turned into personal messages, and Sophie found herself reading them repeatedly, memorizing each word, feeling both joy and dread as she did, because she knew that what she felt for Ethan was a betrayal of everything she held sacred, everything she loved, yet the pull toward him was magnetic, irresistible, and it became impossible to ignore. She remembered the evenings when Daniel came home tired from work, his shoulders heavy with responsibility, and she would hug him tightly, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart, and a stab of guilt would cut through her chest as she realized she was hiding a secret that could shatter their entire life, a secret that made the safe world she had built feel suddenly fragile, like glass teetering on the edge of a counter, ready to fall with the slightest touch. One late night, after a particularly stressful day filled with deadlines and demanding clients, Ethan asked if she wanted to walk to a nearby cafe, just to talk, to get away from the office for a while, and Sophie, her heart pounding, agreed, knowing that she was stepping into dangerous territory but unable to resist the magnetic pull of his presence. The way he made her feel both seen and alive, like a part of herself that had been dormant for years was waking up with every word, every laugh, every glance. As they walked under the city lights, the streets quiet except for the occasional car passing by, Sophie found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, the tension of the day dissolving in Ethan's company. Yet every moment was tainted by the knowledge that Daniel would never approve, that she was betraying a man who loved her completely, a man who had been her rock, her safe place, the center of her world, and that knowledge twisted her stomach into knots she could not ignore. At the cafe, they sat at a small table near the window, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold, talking about work, life, dreams, and memories, sharing little stories that were meant to be harmless but felt like confessions, and with every laugh, every shared secret, Sophie felt herself falling further, deeper, into something she knew she could not control, something that was thrilling and dangerous and utterly consuming, and yet she couldn't stop herself, couldn't turn away from the intensity that Ethan brought into her life, a feeling that both frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure. The walk back to the office was quiet, each lost in their thoughts, but Sophie could feel the tension crackling between them, subtle gestures, accidental brushes of hands, fleeting glances that lingered longer than they should, and she knew, deep down, that the line had already been crossed, even if they hadn't admitted it out loud yet, even if they were still clinging to the pretense of professionalism, because emotions, once awakened, could not easily be silenced. The next day, Sophie found herself distracted, her mind replaying every moment with Ethan, remembering the warmth of his hand brushing hers as they reached for the same pen, the way he had laughed at a joke she barely remembered, the softness in his voice when he asked about her weekend plans, and she realized she was thinking about him constantly, unable to focus on spreadsheets, reports, and meetings, unable to concentrate on emails or phone calls, unable to stop imagining moments that were innocent to the world but loaded with meaning in her mind, moments that left her heart racing and her conscience heavy with guilt. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things, that this was only temporary, a harmless infatuation, but the pull grew stronger each day, growing like a vine that crept through her thoughts, entwining itself around her heart and mind, making it impossible to ignore the desires she had long suppressed, desires she hadn't realized were still alive inside her, desires that made her question everything she had built, everything she had believed in, everything she had promised herself. At home, Daniel noticed her distance, the quiet tension that hadn't been there before, the moments when she seemed lost in thought, staring blankly at walls or screens, and he asked gently if something was wrong, if she needed help, if he had done something to upset her, and Sophie smiled, forcing herself to say that everything was fine, that work had been stressful, that she just needed rest, even as her chest tightened with guilt and shame, knowing that she was hiding a secret that could destroy the foundation of their marriage, a secret that felt both thrilling and terrifying, a secret that was no longer just an emotional infatuation but a spark of something far more dangerous. She began to notice herself lingering in the office after hours, staying later than necessary, pretending to finish tasks while really just hoping to catch another glance from Ethan, another moment of shared laughter, another connection that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt for years, and every time she left the office, she felt a mixture of exhilaration and dread, knowing that her actions were risky, knowing that every choice was a step closer to crossing a line she could never uncross. Sophie tried to justify her feelings as a search for excitement, as a need to feel desired, as a craving for emotional connection, but she couldn't deny the intense longing that grew with every conversation, every interaction, every shared moment, making her restless, distracted, and emotionally fragile, and she began to wonder how long she could keep pretending, how long she could hide the truth from Daniel, how long she could continue down a path that felt so thrilling yet so dangerous, a path that could shatter the life she had spent years building. One afternoon, as Sophie and Ethan stayed late to complete a project together, the office empty except for the two of them, their conversation turned personal, their jokes softer, their laughter closer, and Sophie felt a surge of emotions she had tried to suppress for weeks, a mixture of longing, excitement, fear, and guilt that left her breathless, realizing that the line between friendship and something more had already been crossed in their hearts, even if their lips had not yet betrayed. That truth, and that realization both terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. As they packed up their things and prepared to leave, Ethan smiled at her, a quiet, intimate smile that lingered far longer than necessary, and Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, knowing that the next steps she might take could change everything, knowing that the life she loved, the family she cherished, the man she had promised herself to, could all be at risk because of the dangerous, irresistible connection she felt toward Ethan, and she walked home that night in silence, her mind racing with possibilities, regrets, and desires, knowing that the choices she made in the coming days could either awaken a part of her she had long forgotten or destroy the very world she had built, a tension that left her unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling while Daniel lay peacefully beside her, dreaming unaware of the storm brewing in Sophie's heart, a storm that was growing stronger, faster, and more unstoppable with every passing day, and Sophie knew, deep down, that she was on the edge of a decision that could alter everything, a decision she would never be able to take back, a mistake that could cost her everything she loved. Everything she had worked for, everything she held dear, and with that realization, she felt a chill run through her spine, a mixture of fear and desire that kept her awake long into the night, knowing that her life had changed in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. Sophie knew that the fragile balance she had been holding for weeks was about to shatter, the tension in her chest growing unbearable as she tried to keep her emotions in check, pretending at home that nothing had changed while her mind raced endlessly with thoughts of Ethan, of the stolen moments, of the spark that made her feel alive yet so guilty, and it all came crashing down one evening when Daniel, usually calm and patient, walked into the room holding her phone with a quiet intensity that made her stomach drop, his eyes hollow, voice steady but broken, asking if what he had seen was true, and Sophie, frozen for a moment, felt her heart clench with panic, realizing that the secret she had tried so hard to keep hidden had been exposed, that the private world she had created between herself and Ethan had collided violently with the life she had promised to protect, and the shame and fear washed over her in a wave so strong it left her breathless. She tried to explain, stumbling over words, voice trembling, telling Daniel that it was a mistake, a momentary lapse, that it meant nothing, that she still loved him, but the words sounded hollow even to her. The truth of her emotions tangled with guilt and longing in ways she could not untangle, and Daniel, silent for a long moment, shook his head, his expression unreadable, a storm of hurt and disappointment in his eyes, and Sophie felt the weight of the consequences press down on her chest. Suffocating and heavy, because she knew that the trust they had built over years had been broken, maybe irreparably, and there was no turning back from the revelation she had feared for so long. The days that followed were filled with a tense, quiet distance, Daniel speaking only in measured tones, Sophie apologizing repeatedly, tears streaming down her face, and yet the unspoken pain hung in the air, a shadow that darkened every room, every meal, every conversation, making Sophie feel like an intruder in her own home, as if the life she had taken for granted had been pulled out from under her feet, leaving her standing on the edge of a precipice with nothing to hold on to but her guilt and regret. Sophie tried to focus on Daniel, tried to show him that she still loved him, tried to repair the cracks in their relationship, but every glance, every word, every small interaction was colored by the memory of her betrayal, and she saw the change in his eyes, the hesitation, the pain, the distance, a barrier she had never imagined existing between them, a wall that no apology could immediately tear down, and she realized that love alone was not enough to heal a wound this deep, that trust, once broken, required time, patience, and proof, and she feared she had none of those in abundance. Daniel finally spoke of practical steps, mentioning lawyers, legal advice, and divorce in words that seemed both surreal and final, a cold reality hitting Sophie like a blow to the chest, and she felt herself spiral into a whirlpool of panic, grief, and disbelief, struggling to imagine a future without the life they had built together, without the man who had been her partner, her friend, her safe harbor in every storm, and yet she could not deny the truth of what she had done, could not escape the consequences of her choices, could not undo the emotional damage she had caused, and in that moment, Sophie felt the full weight of her actions crush her, leaving her trembling, hollow, and desperate for a chance to turn back time. Nights became unbearable. Sophie lay awake while Daniel slept, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing, each inhale and exhale a reminder of what she had endangered, imagining conversations she could never have, apologies she could never fully convey, and feeling an emptiness that made her chest ache as she realized that her secret, once thrilling, had transformed into a chain around her heart, binding her with shame and sorrow she could not shake. She thought of her children, innocent and unaware, and a fresh wave of guilt hit her, because Sophie knew that telling them the truth would shatter their world, yet keeping them in the dark felt cruel and dishonest, and she spent hours pacing, imagining the questions they might ask, the confusion in their eyes, the heartbreak they might feel, all while trying to hold herself together in front of Daniel, who now seemed distant, his love and trust suspended in a fragile, uncertain space that Sophie feared might never return to what it once had been. Days turned into tense routines, each interaction heavy with unspoken words, each glance carrying a weight of emotion neither could fully express, and Sophie realized that the life she had always considered stable and safe had become a battlefield of emotions, regrets, and longing, a place where every step was fraught with danger, every word could ignite conflict, and every silence was a reminder of the irreparable breach she had caused, a reminder that the consequences of one moment of weakness could ripple endlessly through the people she loved most. Sophie tried to occupy herself with work, with chores, with anything that could distract her from the constant ache in her chest, the guilt that gnawed at her, the memories of stolen smiles and conversations that had once seemed harmless, yet she could not escape the truth. She had made a choice that changed everything, and there was no simple way to fix it, no magic words that could restore trust instantly, no gesture that could erase the hurt she had caused, only the slow, painful process of facing reality, accepting responsibility, and hoping that somehow, in time, love could survive the fracture she had inflicted. The weight of the secret, once thrilling, now became a torment, and Sophie began to understand the depth of what she had risked, the fragility of trust, and the way a single decision, made in a moment of temptation and desire, could ripple outward, affecting not just her marriage but the emotional well-being of her family. And she realized that this was the first time in her life she truly understood the consequences of her actions in a way that left her both terrified and resolute to make amends in whatever ways she could. As Daniel moved forward with plans for legal counsel, the house became quieter, heavier, filled with the absence of laughter, the absence of warmth, and the weight of unspoken emotions, leaving Sophie to confront herself in the mirror, to see the reflection of a woman who had allowed desire to overtake judgment, who had broken trust she could never fully restore overnight, and who now faced the task of rebuilding not only her marriage but her sense of self, knowing that the journey would be long, painful, and uncertain. Sophie began to write in secret, pouring her thoughts onto paper, hoping to untangle the whirlwind of feelings inside her, to understand why she had strayed emotionally, to find a way to communicate remorse and love to Daniel in a way that might bridge the chasm that had opened between them, and while writing, she realized that understanding herself was the first step toward healing, that acknowledging her mistakes fully, without excuses, was the only way to begin mending the bonds she had damaged, and that perhaps, with patience, honesty, and time, there might be a path forward, even if the road was uncertain and fraught with pain. Yet even as Sophie worked to understand herself, even as she sought forgiveness in her heart, she could not stop the emotional tension from spilling over into her daily life, into her interactions with Daniel, with her children, and with colleagues who noticed the change in her demeanor, the heaviness in her eyes, the quiet distraction that seemed to follow her everywhere, and she felt isolated, trapped in a world where one mistake had turned every familiar place into a reminder of loss, every smile into a memory of what could no longer be, every night into a battle between guilt, longing, and the faint hope of reconciliation. In quiet moments, Sophie replayed the confrontation, the moment Daniel held her phone, the silence that followed her confession, the tears in his eyes, and she realized that the consequences of her actions were not only emotional but deeply personal, a lesson in how fragile human connections could be, how easily trust could be broken, and how painfully difficult it could be to rebuild, and she vowed, silently, to do everything within her power to demonstrate remorse, to repair the damage, to show through actions rather than words that she understood the gravity of her choices, while knowing that some wounds might never fully heal, some distances might never fully close, and some moments of longing might always linger in the shadows of her heart. Days blended into nights, Sophie's routine now defined by quiet reflection, tears shed in private, long walks where she tried to sort her thoughts, moments of self-reproach, and moments of longing for the life that had once been simple and joyful, a life now tainted by her own decisions, and every attempt to reach Daniel was met with measured distance, polite words masking the deeper hurt he felt, and Sophie understood that healing would require more than apologies, it would require consistency, patience, proof of change, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths, both about herself and about the dynamics of their relationship. Sophie thought constantly about her children, the innocence she feared she had tarnished, the future conversations that loomed like storms on the horizon, and she felt a profound responsibility not just to Daniel but to them, realizing that honesty, when handled with care, might help preserve their sense of stability even as her personal mistakes threatened to upend the family, and she began to plan, carefully, gently, for the difficult conversations ahead, knowing that shielding them entirely would be impossible, yet understanding that the timing, tone, and approach could make a difference in how they processed the heartbreak around them. Nights were the hardest. Sophie lay awake, replaying her choices, imagining Daniel's pain, imagining the ripple effect on their children, imagining the potential loss of everything she had built with love and care, and she understood that her emotional journey was far from over, that each day would bring challenges, that the path to redemption would be long and uncertain, and that only through honesty, patience, and unwavering commitment to change could she hope to navigate the storm she had unleashed, even as the consequences of her emotional mistake loomed over every moment of her life, casting shadows that could not be ignored. And as Sophie finally allowed herself to rest, exhausted from the emotional turmoil, she knew one thing with certainty: nothing would ever be the same again. Every choice moving forward mattered, every word held weight, every glance carried meaning, and the love she felt for Daniel, though fractured, was still alive, a fragile ember she intended to nurture, protect, and rebuild if she could, no matter how difficult, painful, or uncertain the journey might be. Sophie woke up to a silence she had not felt in years, the house heavy with the absence of laughter, the absence of warmth, the absence of certainty, and as she moved through her morning routine, she realized that the life she had taken for granted was now fragile, a delicate structure built on trust that had been cracked by her own choices, and with each step, each movement, she felt the weight of consequences pressing on her chest, making her heart ache with regret, longing, and a desperate hope that somehow, someway, she could repair the damage she had caused before it was too late. The days stretched long, filled with quiet reflection, moments of self-reproach, and careful observation of Daniel, who now moved through the house with a calm detachment that spoke louder than words ever could, his eyes distant, his gestures measured, his smiles rare and fleeting, and Sophie knew that rebuilding their bond would require more than apologies, more than fleeting gestures, more than tears shed in private. It would require patience, consistency, honesty, and a willingness to face every uncomfortable truth about herself, about their marriage, and about the choices that had led them to this point. She spent hours alone, journaling her thoughts, unpacking the tangled emotions that had driven her into the arms of temptation, analyzing every interaction with Ethan, every fleeting thrill, every moment that had seemed harmless at first but had grown into an emotional whirlwind she could no longer contain. And in the quiet of her own mind, Sophie began to understand the depth of her own vulnerabilities, the ways she had neglected her own needs, the ways she had allowed desire to cloud judgment, and the ways she had underestimated the fragility of trust in a relationship built over years of love, laughter, and shared dreams. Sophie realized that while she had been chasing excitement, she had lost sight of the foundation of her life, the man who had been her partner, her confidant, her safe harbor in every storm, and that the thrill she had felt with Ethan, though intoxicating, could never replace the steady, unwavering love that Daniel had always given her. And in that realization, a mixture of relief and sorrow settled over her, because she understood that she had the power to make amends, to demonstrate remorse, To prove that love, when sincere, could survive even the most difficult trials, though it would not be easy and the road would be long. She thought constantly about her children, their innocent eyes, their trust in their parents, their belief in the stability of the family unit, and she knew that protecting them required courage, honesty, and a careful approach, because shielding them entirely from the truth would be impossible, yet revealing too much too soon could shatter the delicate world they still relied upon. And Sophie spent hours planning, thinking of the words she would use, the tone, the timing, trying to ensure that any conversations would nurture understanding rather than fear, empathy rather than blame, and compassion rather than resentment. As the days passed, Sophie noticed small changes in herself, a growing clarity of purpose, a deepening understanding of the fragility and value of trust, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable realities of her actions without flinching, acknowledging that true redemption required facing pain, accepting consequences, and committing to growth, not only for her marriage but for her own heart, which had wandered into dangerous territory and now needed guidance, reflection, and healing to find its way back to what was right, to what mattered, to what could be saved. She began speaking more openly with Daniel, starting with small conversations, tentative and careful, sharing her thoughts about her own failings, acknowledging the mistakes she had made, expressing gratitude for the patience he had shown despite the hurt, and gradually, she found that while the wounds were still fresh and raw, communication could act as a bridge over the chasm her actions had created, a bridge built with honesty, remorse, and a genuine desire to rebuild the trust that had been broken. Sophie also sought external support, talking to a counselor who helped her navigate the complicated emotions of guilt, longing, love, and fear, someone who could provide guidance in untangling her feelings, in understanding why she had been drawn to excitement outside her marriage, and in developing strategies to repair the damage she had caused without further hurting Daniel or the children. And in doing so, she discovered that self-awareness and professional guidance could help her not only heal but also grow, becoming a stronger, more conscious partner, a parent more attuned to the needs of her family, and a person more resilient to temptation in the future. One afternoon, after weeks of careful reflection, Sophie decided to speak to Daniel about the children, knowing that hiding the truth for too long would only make the eventual revelation more painful, and she approached him gently, with empathy, explaining that she wanted to be honest with them in a way that was age-appropriate, compassionate, and constructive, acknowledging the pain that her mistakes had caused and the responsibility she had to rebuild trust with them as well as with him, and Daniel, though still wary and hurt, agreed that honesty, handled with care, was the best path forward, and in that moment, Sophie felt a tentative glimmer of hope, knowing that while the road ahead would be difficult, it was not impossible. Sophie planned carefully how she would speak to the children, preparing her words to express love, accountability, and reassurance, and she focused on showing them that mistakes, while serious, could lead to growth, that forgiveness was possible when accompanied by sincere effort, and that family bonds, though tested, could endure if nurtured with patience and care. And in preparing for these conversations, Sophie felt a sense of empowerment, a feeling that even in the wake of her errors, she could actively participate in healing the relationships she had endangered, and that her actions now could shape the future in a positive way. As days turned into weeks, Sophie noticed small changes in Daniel as well, subtle shifts in his demeanor, moments where his eyes softened, where brief smiles appeared during shared tasks, where conversation flowed a little more naturally. And Sophie understood that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt slowly, step by step, not through grand gestures but through consistent, deliberate actions that demonstrated remorse, commitment, and love, and she rededicated herself to living in a way that honored the relationship, the family, and the vows she had made, knowing that redemption was possible, though it required humility, patience, and unwavering effort. Sophie also took time to reflect deeply on her connection with Ethan, realizing that the emotional thrill she had pursued could never compare to the depth, history, and commitment she shared with Daniel, and she resolved to remove any potential for future temptation, setting boundaries with Ethan, limiting unnecessary interactions, and keeping her focus on her marriage, understanding that love required discipline, sacrifice, and conscious choice, and that the excitement of a fleeting Infatuation could never replace the profound connection and trust she had once taken for granted. With each passing day, Sophie felt herself growing stronger emotionally, learning from her mistakes, embracing responsibility fully, and approaching her family with a newfound appreciation, tenderness, and sincerity, knowing that the journey of rebuilding trust would be long, sometimes painful, but ultimately worth every effort because the love she felt for Daniel and the commitment she had to her children were far more valuable than any momentary thrill she had ever experienced. Nights became calmer, filled with quiet reflection rather than guilt-ridden insomnia, as Sophie allowed herself to acknowledge the pain, to grieve the mistakes, and to hope for a future that could be rebuilt, one step at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one act of love and dedication at a time, and in that process, she discovered that true growth came not from avoiding mistakes but from facing them fully, learning from them, and using them to forge a stronger, more resilient, and more loving self, capable of nurturing the family and relationships she had endangered. And as Sophie moved forward, carefully navigating each interaction with Daniel and the children, maintaining honesty, expressing love, demonstrating consistency, and holding herself accountable for her actions, she felt a quiet but growing sense of hope, a realization that while mistakes could not be erased, forgiveness, healing, and renewed connection were possible, and that with patience, effort, and sincere commitment, her family could emerge from the shadow of her errors stronger, wiser, and more united, and Sophie resolved to dedicate herself fully to this path, embracing the difficult but necessary journey of redemption, love, and restoration, knowing that while the past could not be undone, the future was still within her hands, waiting to be shaped by her choices, guided by her heart, and nurtured with unwavering love.